The Izhevsk Automobile Plant did not begin as an independent car manufacturer. It began as an additional production site for Moskvich, a backup plant that built the same cars only under a different badge. But Izhmash had its own design bureau, its own ambitions, and a clear desire to step out of the shadow of its more famous Moscow relative. And the most interesting part is that it really had a chance to do so. Created in the late 1960s on the basis of the Moskvich, the Izh Kombi turned out to be a very successful model for the USSR. In a country where an ordinary buyer could not simply buy a station wagon, the liftback body gave them almost the maximum practicality available in a private passenger car. To build on that success and finally create a truly independent model of its own, Izhevsk began developing a new generation of liftback in the 1970s. Later, this car received the name Oda. But because of the peculiarities of the Soviet system, the Combi stayed in production for far too long, and even outlived the country that had created it. And the Oda entered production far too late, only after the Soviet state had disappeared. So today, we will look at why two promising cars still failed to turn a backup plant into an independent player. In the 1960s, the Soviet Union faced a problem. People already wanted to buy cars and had the money to pay for them, but there was not enough production capacity to satisfy that demand. This is where the famous Soviet waiting lists for cars came from. In some periods, they could stretch for more than 10 years. The situation was unusual. The basic expenses of a Soviet citizen, such as housing, utilities, transport, education, and healthcare, were either low or covered by the state and free for the public. So people began to accumulate money, but there was almost nowhere to spend it. Under these conditions, the car was an ideal way to absorb people's excess savings. But first, those cars had to be built, and that was the problem. The Soviet passenger car industry produced too few cars for such a huge country. On top of that, a significant share of production went for export, because hard currency earnings were an important priority for the economy. As a result, a strange paradox appeared. There was a buyer with money, there was demand, but there were no available cars for that buyer. This same logic would later lead to the purchase of a license for the modernized Fiat 124 and the construction of the famous Lada automobile plant. But even before that, the USSR decided to create an additional production site for Moskvich, a plant that could build already existing models and increase the overall production volume. Izhevsk was chosen as the location, and this car production was not created from scratch in an empty field. It was built into the system of Izhmash, a powerful defense and machine-building complex whose main products were firearms, including Kalashnikov rifles. Dmitry Ustinov, then the Minister of the Defense Industry of the USSR, played an important role in this decision. For him, it was a convenient industrial solution and a way to strengthen his own position and power. At first glance, weapons and cars belong to different worlds, but both are complex forms of serial machine building. Besides, Izh motorcycles were already produced in Izhevsk, so cars were a logical addition to them. At the same time, the new car production received its own design bureau. And when a plant has engineers, a production base, and political support, sooner or later the role of a simple branch plant becomes too small for it. Launching the new production required enormous investment. Although the car plant was built into an already existing industrial complex, new workshops with a total area of about 500,000 square meters had to be constructed, and modern foreign equipment had to be purchased. A noticeable part of this equipment was connected with French industry. In particular, body production used technologies and equipment licensed by Renault. In the USSR, the French auto industry was generally taken seriously. It was no coincidence that the Renault 16 had also been considered as one of the possible models to be produced under license, instead of the Fiat 124. The first cars began rolling off the assembly line in 1966. These were Moskvich 408 cars with a new badge. In essence, it was the same car, but among buyers, the Izhevsk-built Moskvich quickly gained a good reputation. Both Izhmash's defense industry status and the new Western equipment played their part, so the Izhevsk-built Moskvich cars were probably seen as quality machines for a reason. But the Izhevsk engineers were not going to be satisfied with the role of a simple assembly operation. After the debut of the Renault 16, which won the European Car of the Year title in 1966, Izhevsk decided to use it as a reference point. Perhaps the Izhevsk engineers were among the first in the USSR to see the potential of a five-door liftback body. In that same year, 1966, when the assembly line had not even reached full capacity yet, they already presented a prototype of their own five-door car. It was not a conventional station wagon, but a car with a steeply sloped rear window and a roof that was longer than on the sedan. The car was noticeably different from the original Moskvich. It had a different front end, a distinctive radiator grille, and new rear lights. At the same time, the door openings and windshield remained unchanged. There were concerns that the Ministry of the Automotive Industry would block the project. Formally, a liftback was not very different from a station wagon, and station wagons in the Soviet Union were not sold to private buyers. They were intended mainly for state organizations. According to Soviet logic, such a car was excessive for the ordinary Soviet citizen and could encourage illegal income. However, the project, which received the name Izh Kombi, was still approved by the ministry for serial production. The first production combis began rolling off the assembly line in 1973. Today, a car with this kind of rear hatch looks completely ordinary. But in the early 1970s, next to other Moskvich models and even the new Lada 2101, the Izhevsk car looked very fresh. For the conservative Soviet buyer, the Combi's appearance might have been too avant-garde, if not for one thing: practicality. Buyers quickly realized that this body was noticeably more practical than a regular sedan, but at the same time did not look like a bulky station wagon, thanks to the steep angle of the rear door. The tough and unpretentious Izh Kombi was especially valued in rural areas for its ability to carry cargo. But then, Moskvich ran into a sad reality. The once advanced plant, one of the leaders of the industry, began to be openly pushed into the background, while resources and attention went to the newly built Lada plant. Instead of launching new models, Moskvich increasingly limited itself to modernizing old ones, keeping them in production for an embarrassingly long time. Izh, the Moskvich backup plant, did not escape the same fate. The Combi received its first serious update only in 1982. In essence, it was an exterior upgrade in the spirit of the time, when chrome was giving way to plastic. After the restyling, the Izh Kombi looked more modern, but it also lost part of its former upscale feel. The trim became rougher and more primitive. Even so, demand for the car remained stable. However, with every passing year, the reputation of a car built by a defense industry plant kept getting worse. By the early 1990s, when the Soviet Union no longer existed, but the Combi was still on the assembly line, quality had fallen to a truly terrible level. Some cars were painted without proper primer, effectively straight over bare metal, which meant the body could rust through in just 1 or 2 winters. Under-equipped cars were also common. Some were missing mud flaps, others were missing windshield wipers. There's even a known case of a man buying a new Izh Kombi that had left the factory without shock absorbers. In this kind of agony, the Combi lasted until 1997, when it was finally discontinued. The car quietly disappeared from the assembly line with a reputation that had become highly questionable. But you may remember that at the beginning I mentioned the Izh Oda, the car that was supposed to replace the Combi. And this is where the main twist of the story begins. The bitter irony was that the Izh Oda, whose normal mass production only managed to begin around the turn of the 2000s, had actually been under development since the mid-1970s. After putting the Combi into production, the Izhevsk engineers quickly realized that they had found the right direction, and that this success had to be built upon. They correctly understood 2 things. First, dependence on the Moscow plant was seriously slowing down Izh's development. Second, the potential of the Combi itself was already limited. The plant needed a new model, one that would distance itself from Moskvich, open the way to export markets, and move Izh out of the category of secondary enterprises. The Izhevsk engineers also noticed the growing trend toward front-wheel drive. As early as the beginning of the 1970s, they were working on a front-wheel drive prototype, but this direction was shut down for Izh from above. The Ministry of the Automotive Industry greeted the initiative without much enthusiasm. As already mentioned, Izh was not seen as an independent player, but as a plant for domestic needs, while Lada and Moskvich were already working for export. However, Izhevsk had a powerful patron, Dmitry Ustinov. Thanks to his support, in 1975, the enterprise finally managed to get the green light for its own project, but with one important restriction. The new model had to remain rear-wheel drive. Still, at that moment, this was not yet a death sentence. There were still plenty of modern cars in the world with a classic front-engine, rear-wheel drive layout. The future Izh 2126 later received the name Orbit. The first experimental prototypes appeared as early as 1977, and next to the Combi that was rolling off the assembly line, they really did look modern. But after that, a long process of refinement began. The car's design changed several times. From the angular early versions, it gradually moved towards smoother lines and more rounded surfaces. But the problems of Moskvich and its Izhevsk backup plant did not disappear. The launch of Orbit into production kept being postponed, while the Combi remained on the assembly line. By 1983, the design and appearance of the prototypes had been brought to the level required for final pre-production testing. In 1984, the Izh 2126 underwent state trials, where it was compared with modern foreign rivals such as the Ford Sierra, Toyota Corolla, and Saab 900. That same year, the ministry finally approved the car for production, but this did little to help the production Orbit. At the end of 1984, Dmitry Ustinov died, and the plant lost its most influential patron. After that, the launch was postponed again, and the engineers were forced to simplify the car in order to reduce production costs. The engineers had no choice but to keep working on the Orbit. Only now, not in the direction of improvements, but in the opposite direction: simplification. They had to abandon the promising rear trailing arm spring suspension with A-shaped arms, seriously simplify the interior and its materials, and completely forget about the version with a hydromechanical transmission. Despite this, the work was done fairly quickly. By 1987, the engineers had presented a new pre-production prototype. But difficult times were beginning for the entire industry, just as they were for the entire Soviet economy. Funding for new projects was sharply reduced. However, either the Orbit was no longer considered a new project, since it had already been in development for more than 10 years, or an exception was simply made for it. Modern foreign equipment was purchased for the Orbit from Japan, Germany, and Portugal, and the buildings for the corresponding workshops were also constructed. It seemed that production was finally very close. But by 1990, the Soviet state was already in the final stage of its agony, and launching a major project normally was almost impossible. Nevertheless, Izhevsk was almost fully ready, so small-scale production of the Orbit began in 1990. The volumes were so modest that it was more of a semi-production run than normal mass production. By 1995, only a few thousand cars had been built. On top of that, it turned out that the Orbit trade name had already been reserved by Ital Design back in 1986, so the Izh cars being assembled received only the numerical index 2126, without the Orbit name. The first buyers appreciated that, in terms of off-road ability, payload capacity, and interior space, the new Izhmash model really did surpass some of its competitors from Togliatti. The car was simple, spacious, and practical. Unfortunately, small-scale production, the lack of public awareness around the Izh 2126, and extremely poor build quality dealt a serious blow to the model's image. In the informal hierarchy, it quickly slipped down to the level of the Oka and Tavria, and was valued noticeably lower than the Lada Samara and even the Moskvich Aleko. Mass production was only restored in 1999. Instead of Orbit, the model was now called Oda, and externally it was almost no different from the pre-production prototype of the late 1980s. So, from the first Orbit prototypes to normal mass production, 22 years had passed. And of course, by that point, the Oda already had a poor reputation as a car with bad assembly quality, low reliability, and an outdated design. Neither the fabulous station wagon, nor the four-wheel drive versions, nor later updates and restylings could really help it. Naturally, the Oda did not get a happy ending. Its production lasted 15 years and ended in 2005, with a total output of about 140,000 cars. It was discontinued just as quietly and ingloriously as the Combi had been before it. In the end, they became two related failures. The Combi stayed on the assembly line for too long, the Oda took too long to reach it, and Izh never managed to become the independent automobile plant it could have been.